You are listening to Lang FM, the podcast about language and what people do with it. On today's episode, I have a very special guest, Brian Fox. Brian spent most of his working life at the interpreting service of the European Commission, DG Interpretation, or SCIC, as it is also known. I was lucky enough to be able to sit down with Brian for a chat before he headed off into his well-deserved retirement in 2016. So listen in and enjoy the conversation. Just things I wanted to talk about, basically. For example, I remember you, I think it was during a SCIC university conference, you remember talking about proudly that you were Geordie. So you are from Newcastle, is that right? That's or the area.
Yeah, my dad was in the RAF, so we moved every few years, but we ended up in the northeast of England, and I was there from the age of 10 until I went to university.
So did you pick up any Geordie? Is that what you...
Slightly. I didn't think I spoke with a Geordie accent, but when I went south, somebody asked me where on earth this accent came from. So I realised that I did have one. On the other hand, my Geordie friends all reproached me that I always spoke too posh. So you can't win them all, but I managed to lose them all.
Yeah. Is it very different from standard English? Is it more like an accent, or is it really like a proper dialect?
It's probably in between. There are a lot of recognisable English words, but for example, well before the freedom of travel within the EU, the Danes used to come across and pillage Northumbria, which was rich in monasteries and silver and gold, etc., etc. And they would burn everything in sight and take everything movable away with them. And after a while, they decided that they could eliminate the transport costs and time, and some of them set up camp in Northumberland. So Geordie has a lot of Danish elements in it, strangely. So, for example, to go home in Danish is, I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's written gan hemma. Yeah. And in Geordie, it's gan hjem. To go home is gan hjem. I'm gan hjem. Yeah.
Do you also do you have an allegiance to Newcastle United or any football allegiances?
No, I'm afraid I'm very boring from that point of view. I used to love playing football. I even played for the SCIC side until an advanced age.
The tournament,
and we used to play what was called the Embassy Leagues. No, I enjoyed it, but I've never. I always preferred playing it to watching it.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. So in terms of languages, your parents are both English?
Nope.
No,
my mum's Italian.
Okay, so that's where the multilingualism starts.
So I started bilingual, and it's interesting because, you always talk about, we used to say our mother tongue, because it used to be the mother's tongue. But in fact, my mother's tongue is not my mother tongue.
Yes, that would be right.
And this is why people started moving on to things like main language, first language, principal language. I'm a bit retrograde, so I still say mother tongue. But,
fair enough. But your mother tongue would then be Italian?
Yeah.
And your mum spoke Italian with you at home? Or?
Yeah.
But you would still consider it your second?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, no, I always lived in England. I spent 3 delightful months every year in Italy. For the summer, exactly, and I love that. But I can speak much more freely in English in any register. I can speak freely in Italian in every register except formal Italian, or legalese or something like that, and there I'm lost.
I see. And was your dad on assignment as an RAF pilot in Italy? Is that how they met?
Yeah, absolutely.
But you grew up then in the north of England?
I was actually born in the southernmost point of England, Ramsgate, near Sandwich. Okay. And then we moved all over the place. But I spent the last 10 years of my school life in the north of England. Yeah.
I read somewhere that was the Duke of Northumberland School.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
That's
because
right.
that's a very posh,
It is, isn't
posh
it?
title. Yeah. So is it like I would imagine an old English school, like an old building and everything?
It's a very old building.
Yeah.
It's a listed monument, but they keep changing the educational system in England. So I mean, nobody would recognise that name anymore, apart from very old people in the town. And there used to be a Duke of Northumberland School and a Duchess of Northumberland School, and you can deduce from that one was a boys' school and one was a girls' school.
Yeah.
So.
And I read as well that you spent some time in the French educational system as well in Aix-en-Provence.
Yes,
or was that for university?
That was my third year of university, because at the time in the UK they knew that there was very little exposure to foreign languages. So if you were a foreign language student, you were required to go for your third year abroad somewhere.
Yeah. And what exactly did you have foreign languages at school as well? So could you use the Italian in any way at school? No advantage there.
No,
that's a
nothing
shame.
at all. I got my A level in Italian, but it was almost all, so well, with the help of my mum.
Yeah.
But it was just me studying and her correcting or whatever.
Yeah. But did you still have Greek or Latin or anything?
We had Latin, yeah.
So not useful for the summer holidays then?
Well, you know,
not necessarily. At least.
Greek, ancient Greek and Latin used to be the prime requirement if you wanted to be any sort of administrator in the British Empire. You could do they were called the Greats.
The Greats.
And you went to university and you did the Greats, and that equipped you to do everything.
Okay.
This was then.
That has probably changed.
Times have changed.
And I don't know if you want to go into the situation of foreign languages in the UK now, which is quite difficult. And it occupied you during your working life as well.
Indeed.
In trying to find qualified people for the service here.
Yeah. Well, strange enough, the people who taught languages and the people who fought for languages were really very gifted and very dedicated and extremely innovative in what they were doing. But there was no groundswell of opinion to back them up, and it was always seen as a soft option compared to the useful stuff, like the STEMs, the scientific mathematics, etc., etc. Which I always thought was a bit of a shame, really.
Yeah.
I mean, the last British ambassador here to the EU was an English literature graduate. And as we said before, times have changed, but at the time you got a university education which trained your mind. What you did it in English-speaking circles, what you did it in, what subject was totally irrelevant.
Yeah, that has definitely changed.
And I still have a great deal of sympathy for that.
Yes.
Apart from the purely vocational things, it's clear if you want to be a doctor, you have to study medicine, and you can't recycle from Beckham Studies or journalism or whatever.
Yeah, but I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So you went on to study what exactly then? Did you study foreign languages?
I studied French and Italian.
French and Italian. So that's like, how do you call it? Yeah, Roman studies or French studies?
This was Scotland, so they were very blunt. It was an MA in French and Italian.
And that was at Edinburgh University?
Yeah.
So was that the first time then you spent time in France when they sent you to Aix-en-Provence to hone your French skills?
I went to Paris when I was 16 and survived, a bit like George Orwell, down and out in London and Paris. So I had that kind of life, but I managed to last a month on a fairly limited amount of money. So that was an eye opener, I have to say, in many respects. And my Italian and my English I grew up with, but French was certainly a matter of passion or a love affair, if you like. Yeah. So there's I make the difference there.
But that was just like a holiday. That was not like a gap year.
No, that was a month holiday. Yeah.
But it was enough to spark your interest, because then I think you worked with French as well, didn't you?
Yes, absolutely.
So you then had your degree from Edinburgh University, and did you apply straight to the SCIC afterwards?
No. I was invited to go to Florence University in Italy to give language classes.
Yeah.
And I went at Easter to talk to the professors, and I was offered a contract and a post, limited post. And after university, after the holidays, I turned up in Florence, and there was no budget. This was a time of contestation between the Christian Democrats and the communists, etc. And they had chosen the languages departments as one of the battlegrounds.
As they do, yeah.
And after a couple of months, there was still no salary, and my money was running out. So So I actually privatized my courses a la Thatcher and told the students that I wasn't being paid, but I certainly had to eat just like them to live.
Sure.
And they would have exams at the end of the year, so maybe we could come to a mutual agreement, which we did. But that didn't last very long.
Yeah. And you probably couldn't do it at university. Did you have to go to a restaurant or to a cafe?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, they were a bit looser then. We managed to go to the university some of the time.
Yeah.
But it was often in the cafeteria and things. And attendance fluctuated as well, of course, as you can imagine.
Yes.
So after that, I wanted to stay on in Italy because I'd never actually lived in Italy. And I was enjoying Florence. Florence was an amazing place at the time.
Is that where your mum's from?
Close, Livorno, which is about 100k. And so I stayed on in Florence doing odd jobs, student jobs, even out of student time. So that was quite interesting, but clearly not something that could go on for a long time. And at the end of the year, I went back to the UK.
And where did the interest come from for interpreting then? Or did you do anything related to that? Because I think you went on to the stage then later on, but what did you do in the meantime?
Well, I never actually. These were golden times when I graduated. First of all, the world was your oyster. Any degree would get you almost anything, as we were saying before. But also there was no real pressure. Nowadays, people are very focused on finding a job as quickly as possible. At the
Because
time,
they have to be as well, maybe. Yeah,
indeed.
Indeed.
At the time, this wasn't the case. I felt that I could take my time and think a little bit about what I wanted to do. It wasn't a straight line career. I didn't study dentistry, in which case I would clearly have become a dentist. But this was a more general sort of portfolio type degree. And I wanted to see. But I'd been an interpreter in the family. But I'd never actually done interpreting.
So you mean you've done it like for your grandparents who didn't speak English,
that kind of stuff. So, I thought, I quite like this. This is quite fun, But I didn't do it as such. And then I got a part-time job or a short-term job with a company in the north of England, which actually was a branch of an Italian construction company, and it wasn't doing very well. The Italian company was doing fine, but the English subsidiary was not doing fine. So they sent the Italian management across, and none of them spoke very much English, if at all. So they hunted around to see, and they contacted my mum, who gave Italian lessons. And she said, well, I'm not going to do it because it was you had to go onto building sites and travel around and stuff. She said, but my son might be interested. And so I did that for, a couple of months. And this was quite fun. And they got to trust me, and we got on very well. And after that, they went back to Italy, and I suddenly became the international liaison point.
So they managed to fix the subsidiary. That's good.
But it went under afterwards anyway. But they managed to sort of limit the losses anyway. And I was casting around for something, and I had a friend who did the stage, and he just said, maybe you'd be interested in this.
But he didn't. He did it as well.
He was doing it when he wrote to me, and by the time I did anything, he'd already failed the stage and gone somewhere else. But I'd written to them, and of course there was no reply.
So the way
9 months later.
The way you applied was just by sending a letter and saying, I'd like to do this.
Yeah.
Will you have me? And these are my credentials.
Yeah. Because I'd never heard of it, and I don't think very many people.
I mean, the UK had probably just joined the EU. I don't know.
I came in '76. I started. 2 or 3 years later, 3 or 4 years later. Yeah. So I turned up, and it went very well.
Yeah.
I have to say, I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. Maybe I would have been more nervous.
Probably nobody did.
Exactly.
Unless you knew someone on the inside, really. But even then,
It struck me that maybe there's some injustice there, because if I had wanted all my life to be an interpreter, I probably would have been so nervous that I would have tripped over several times. But in fact, since I didn't quite know what to expect, I went in fairly relaxed.
So, I mean, just for those who don't know, I mean, the stage was basically an in-house training scheme for interpreters at the Commission
Yeah.
because there were very few training opportunities, I think, or
Absolutely.
the schools didn't provide what the service needed.
That's a good way of saying it. Yes, indeed. The other thing is, not the sort of people who would apply for interpreting courses were not necessarily the sort of people that they were looking for here.
Yeah.
Because I don't have any. I mean, I wasn't then aware of it, but I don't think there was very much going on in Britain in terms of interpreting training. And here it was very high level immediately. I mean, even when you were just, a rookie, you still had to do some fairly, meetings where I'm not saying they were important as such in terms of top level prestige, but they were important for the everyday progress of the union. So it was quite hard. A lot of it was quite difficult, even from the very beginning. I mean, the advantage of the stage was that you went out to the universities to seek people rather than waiting for them. I was an exception here, but rather than waiting for them to contact you.
Yeah.
So it was always targeted on good universities. And therefore, I think the catchment area was different to the people who would normally, of their own free will, have thought about doing interpreting. Many of the people I did the stage with would never have done an interpreting course afterwards. So that was one thing. The other thing is you're immersed in the real world of work. And you were being assessed immediately in real time by hardened professionals. Sometimes very hard professionals too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all heard those stories about it. Very harsh judgment.
Human rights have come in since then.
Yes, and people taking it very personally, as you do. And
Yeah.
But how long did it take you, or how long did it take in general to get through this stuff?
5 months, maybe.
Yeah. So it was very intense, I suppose, because
Yeah.
nowadays, I mean, a degree is at least 2-3 years, I guess, depending on what you do. And you were working just with English, Italian, or French as well?
French as well.
French as well, yeah.
I had a retour into Italian, consecutive,
Okay.
which I very rarely used, to be honest. But most of it was English, French, and then if there was Italian, then most people, or many people, would switch on to you for relay or to others for relay.
And were there already many people working with English as interpreters, or was it still difficult to find people?
We were still short. We were still short.
Because you said, I mean, the education system wasn't really prepared for this kind of thing. Yeah.
No. Seems to be the hallmark of our relationship with the EU, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So you successfully did the stage and then stayed on did you become a staff interpreter immediately, or?
Yes. As soon as I'd done my concours, I did the first concours that came up, and I was successful. So I started as a staff member, and as soon as I started as a staff member, I started on training as well.
Yeah. So training recruits or
I'd had about 16 months experience under my belt, but nobody'd said anything bad, so.
Must have been okay.
Must have been okay.
Yeah. And how did you experience like the first weeks and months of actual work? Was it more or less the same as in the stage, or was it surprising? Did you find it difficult? Or?
Well, I always slept very well on the stage, I have to say. I mean, they were tiring days. It's quite nerve-wracking, and you have to concentrate for long periods. The first day I actually did a real meeting was the harmonization of tower cranes, and at 9 o'clock at night I was in bed. So it's tougher, and you have to develop the real strategies. I mean, you get better as you go along, even in the stage, but you really have to develop your own strategies, and also, I think, just acquire the habit to stay extremely cool. That's very important, I think. I was lucky in that I was fairly phlegmatic to start with. But,
it's probably a good trait of character, yeah. And how did you experience the situation back then with fewer working languages and probably smaller meetings compared to what we have now with, so 28 members, 23, 24 official languages? Well, it must have been different, but how would you say, I mean, what characterized? Was it more intimate, maybe?
Yes, I was just going to say, you took the word from my mouth. It was more intimate, and it was more spontaneous, in that it was genuine discussion.
Yeah.
Nowadays, far more prepared positions are read out rather than spontaneous discussion and exchanges of views. I think it's inevitable.
Well, yeah.
Somebody said the success or the productivity of a meeting is inversely proportional to the number of participants. And according to that thesis, it's only logical that it should be as it is.
Yeah.
What's less useful and less constructive, I think, speaking as an interpreter at any rate, is that everybody should choose not to use the interpreting which is there, and to make more use of English. Not that I have anything against English by any means, but it's always a lingua franca is always. There is no. We were talking about international sign language before. It's very difficult to say that there is one English.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is not, and it helps a lot if you know the speaker's native tongue.
Oh yes.
At one stage, I had to decipher a tape from a radio show, which nobody could decipher because the English was being spoken by somebody who's, I don't want to give too much away, but not a native speaker. And I was called in because I had very strong native language of that speaker. Yeah. And I had I got more than the others had got out of it, but it was very difficult. It was very difficult. So, I don't know if any real communication got through in that, because it's clearly a two-way process. I mean, you can try as hard as you like, but if you don't have the tools to transmit that willpower into actual results, then it's not really communicating.
Yeah, I mean, there's a limit to what we can do. That's true.
It actually takes two people to communicate.
Yes, absolutely. So you said there was more deliberation, I think, going on, but on the other hand, it was probably more formal than meetings are now. I mean, people being, or was that already the case back then? People being on a first name basis, or I mean,
oh yes,
for one thing, people were still allowed to smoke probably back in the day, which is not the case anymore.
Absolutely. No, it was fairly informal. I mean, there was a certain formality because, because things were more formal in those days, and things are more informal now. But groups that met regularly, or at least frequently, they would know each other, or most of them, and so they would always pop round to see each other in the pauses between the meetings. Yeah. And they knew the previous position that had been taken up by that speaker, so they would go across in the coffee break and say, well, look, have you thought about that? Have you thought it through really now? What do you think? What are you going to say when we come round to this? So there was always this going on. I quite liked that side of it, actually. Yeah. And if they couldn't talk directly, then they would come very sheepishly and say, listen, I have to say something to my Italian colleague, and he speaks no English. Would you mind? I said, no, not at all. Come in. So I'd go along and,
that's all
and have a coffee with them.
Yeah.
That's true.
And the service was also smaller back then. I mean, there were just fewer interpreters, and you probably know each other much more.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number, but it must have been around 300 maximum. Yeah. I mean, now we're into
X times that. Yeah. Exactly. So how long did you stay in the booth, as it were, before switching over to other?
Well, it was a gradual transition. So I mean.
Yeah, because you said you did training as well very early on.
I did a bit of training. I started off doing a bit of training, then I did more and more training.
Was it only in-house training, or did you also go to universities?
At that time, it was in-house training. I went, but it was unusual, but I went also to some universities, for example, SCIC in Paris, where some sort of representation was required on our side. They were one of the biggest suppliers of interpreters, if I can use those crude technical terms.
Fair to say,
but it was rare. And the stage, we did do some direct assistance to universities, and we did give some small grants at the time as well. But most of it was channeled through the stage. Yeah. And in fact, I was a trainee. I accompanied, I did the stage myself. Yes. I then turned what we used to call the OSTs, the other sides of the table. So I became a trainer. Yeah. And then I moved up to become a fairly, well, not full-time trainer, but a good half-time trainer, I would say. And then eventually I became the head of unit. And I was actually the head of unit whose job it was to put an end to the stage as well, which was, something I could have done without. But having said that, I mean, I could see it coming. We were getting to the stage with the flourishing of language combinations. We were getting to the stage where there were more trainers than trainees to cover the combination. So I know it was really getting a bit too uncost effective.
Yeah, because I mean, it takes up a lot of resources. I mean, people have to be freed from their usual activities to be put in these trainings, and you need rooms. And
once you'd planned them, once they were programmed, you couldn't unprogram them and send them off somewhere else, or at least not unless you could find somebody equivalent to put in, and that wasn't always very easy.
Although that may have been easier back then because there were fewer languages, and people, I think, technically could cover all the languages more or less.
Absolutely.
With one person. Okay. So you went into other tasks, as it were, administration. I think you did a fair amount of work with universities as well. Also.
Yes.
Was that when the whole thing of what we now call pedagogical assistance started? So a stronger cooperation with
absolutely.
universities?
We always had this cooperation, but it was on a more piecemeal basis, I would say. But when I became head of unit, it coincided with a change of approach, and then everything. I set in place the things, or at least I and everybody else, of course, at the same time, structured it more, introduced the idea that we should also prioritize. This is telescoping in time, of course, because it was a very gradual process, but introducing the idea that we should be prioritizing more on the languages that we needed, and in the end, we had, I think, a very cost-effective operation.
Yeah.
If it wasn't, I mean, a lot of people say, yes, but there are lots of interpreting courses now. But that's not really the point. The point has always been that there have been fewer interpreting courses before than now, for sure. But the point is that we are very unacademic in the way we do things. And I don't think that a university training course would be able to have the resources it has if we weren't there to bolster them. It's as simple as that. Normally speaking, nowadays in academia, you have to have a PhD to get anywhere. There aren't very many well, there are more and more, but there still aren't very many interpreters who have PhDs. And yet we have always been adamant that it's interpreters who have to train interpreters. Just like a driving instructor, you would never take a driving instructor who wasn't a driver.
Ideally, yes. That's true. So you came in the late 70s, then I think Greece joined in 81. Were you already involved with that enlargement from the administrative side, or was it more later than 95?
Only at a distance on the administrative side. I was much more involved in the later Portuguese enlargement, and to a lesser extent the Spanish enlargement, because I'd started studying Portuguese, and so I was an obvious victim. But times were very different. I mean, it sounds like an old fogey, but it used to take me. I had Friday afternoon, which was my permanence, when I had to do these things. So every Friday afternoon, I would go and do Portugal. And when I say that, it's a very active way of describing what I did. I actually tried to get an international phone line, and it could take 2 hours, and it would drop at the slightest provocation. So I sometimes spent my Friday afternoons trying to get a line only to see it drop after 10 seconds, and my Friday evenings, gnashing my teeth in frustration and not having managed to do anything. And I find that so hard to believe now, when you just pick up your phone and you can communicate with the whole world. It's so wonderful.
Even video.
Indeed.
So this was in the 80s?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And I think then for the real big enlargement in 2004, what we often call the Big Bang enlargement, you were already quite actively involved in preparing that, because we had 10 new additional official languages coming into you, and we needed interpreters for that. So
indeed.
Can you describe a little bit how that went? I mean, you started probably years in advance preparing that.
We did, and luckily we did. I think our first contacts with one of the 2004 accession countries was Hungary in 1992. I'm working on memory now, but we started with Budapest in 1992. I'm not saying they were sustained contacts, but we already established channels, let's say. But as it got closer, of course, we got rather more concerned, because we know that our preparations take a long time. Maybe not as long as the rest, but still it has to be done well in advance. So, for example, there were lots of languages that were entirely respectable and have the status they have, just the same as any other language, but they weren't international conference languages. So the usual resources we could turn to for international conference interpreters weren't there. There were very few, very few. And the courses that were there There were some exceptions, but generally speaking, they weren't made for our degree of pickiness. Let me put it in that way. It was fine for the usual stuff, but it wouldn't have done. It didn't do for us. Therefore, we had to start much earlier. Some countries, Malta was a challenge, for example, because it was a small country, 400,000 people at the time, but they were very keen on their language. And it was an official language, but there was, I think, a constant belief throughout the world, or the rest of the world, that Maltese wasn't really necessary, whereas the Maltese made it very clear that it was necessary, or were trying to make it very clear that it was necessary. And when I looked in the SCIC book, there was one gentleman, one colleague, who had Maltese. There were Maltese interpreters, but they were Maltese nationals who interpreted, but not into Maltese.
Yeah. So they didn't have any training possibilities
Virtually
as well.
nothing.
So
No.
But they were willing to set it up to.
They were
sort of
willing to
bolster
set it
their
up.
language and-
Absolutely. I had a visit from the Maltese Academy, which was, I think, if I remember right, about 12 eminent professors.
Interesting.
And
That's
they
such a
were
thing.
absolutely, and they were very keen, almost aggressive, because they said to me, they came, they were very nice, but they said to me, "Who's going to check the Maltese?" I said, "Well, certainly not us. We will be relying on you."
Yes.
Ah, that's okay.
They were relieved. Yeah.
Yes. I think they had this idea that, Brussels was going to decide what was good Maltese or not, but that's not at all our approach, whatever the papers might say.
Yeah, that's right. So it involved a lot of contacts, I suppose, with national ministries and educational.
Yes, and it wasn't always easy,
organizations,
because
universities.
the education ministries had queues of professors saying, my faculty and my course is special and it's a virtual. The tactic we used to use, and I was lucky enough to have some colleagues who were responsible for regions. For example, you mentioned Tony Scott before, Klaus Bischoff for the Baltic states, etc. And they were able to secure contact frequently, and then I was one of the, perhaps not a big gun, but a medium-sized gun that was brought in. And I would see the people in Brussels, the representatives of the country in Brussels, and I would say, "Listen, will you back us up in saying that there is a need for interpreting? Conference interpreting training, which will give you the entire..." "Yes, of course." So then I would go across there, and I discovered, talking to the people in the Ministry of Education, that they have coefficients of funding for courses. So a physics course is more expensive than a French course, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so an interpreting course was thrown into the languages bag, which meant it had a very low coefficient of funding. And what I discovered was, I refused it as a language. Well, I argued, it's not me to refuse, I argued that it was not languages, but that it was an applied skill which used languages. And I made the paragon of music. And music had a very high coefficient, because it required a very high ratio of teacher to pupil, and it required special instruments, in our case, booths, microphones, etc. And there the funding, that was a tactic that worked in many of the countries. And so we were able to secure extra funding, backed by their foreign affairs representatives here.
And I mean, it did work in the end, I think. I mean, there
It
were
did work in the end,
at least a certain amount of interpreters available when the countries joined.
Yeah, well, we had some temporary, for the last 2 years, I had temporary agents in several of the countries, and they either were training in the universities or they were interpreting for our head of delegation in that country. And I know the delegations were delighted to have top quality interpreting available.
That's good to know. Yeah, that it's being appreciated. Yeah. So I suppose for the what was the last one? 2007 was Romania and Bulgaria. That was already a bit easier, I suppose, because they sort of the preparations had already begun, but then it was sort of delayed for several reasons, and they joined later. But I mean, the SCIC or has for a long time, I think, had a role beyond the EU as well. So there's cooperations with Macau, China, I think. There's the African project. There's Russia. So how did that start? Because these languages are not necessarily working languages or official languages of the EU.
Absolutely, absolutely true. Well, it started, actually the Chinese one was the first one. And that started because our then Director General went to China with her husband, who was the Vice President responsible for trade of the Commission. And when they were there, when he was there, the Chinese authorities were interested in interpreting, and they quickly realized that their form of interpreting, for example, they don't do consecutive as we do it, they do it sentence by sentence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They were informed that really when regular meetings of the two parties would take place, there would be interpreting, and it wouldn't be this sort of interpreting at all.
It just takes too long, I suppose, yeah.
And I see it as a form of soft power.
Yeah.
We started this training course, and soon it became a fast track. Why? Because some unknown official in, say, the Ministry of Foreign Trade would come here to do the interpreting course because they knew a language. They only generally knew one of the Western languages.
Yeah.
Then they would go back, and the minister would have them as an interpreter. Not just with us, but wherever they went, they would have a Chinese-English interpreter, for example, and it would always be this dynamic young person, and the minister would see this, and it was a fast track to promotion.
Yeah.
So this became known, and it was very much sought after. Our problem was not taking more than we thought could decently be taken and expected to perform afterwards.
And was it
so that was the start.
Yeah.
Africa, at the time, we were pretty short of interpreters. There was I wouldn't say a drought, but we could always do with more.
So what languages are, because I mean French and English are very important languages in Africa, but you're talking about native African languages now?
At the time, for us, yes, it was French, mostly French and English. There was Portuguese as well, of course. The African countries also are multilingual, and they had problems in finding sufficient numbers of properly trained interpreters as well. But we started off because European interpreters were being, not ours, but freelancers on the European market, let me define that, were being flown down to Africa to work there because there weren't enough African interpreters. And I worked very closely with the other international organizations, etc. YAMLAP, a horrible acronym.
Yeah. So is it the UN or African Union as well?
It's all of them, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We had there was a conference in Nairobi which was organized, which we attended, and we had a resolution there that it should be we should try to train a sufficient number of African professionals in translation and interpreting. Because there was no point importing people. It was more costly for the organizations and less effective for the local population because they weren't really getting anything out of that. And we thought, and the African contingent from the UN and organizations also thought that they were the last of the generations that would come because it was more expensive and more difficult to come across. And that was the origin of the African project, which wasn't just us, of course. It was also the UN, the African Union, etc.
So it was a little bit out of self-interest as well, too.
Yes.
Because you were sort of losing interpreters to other organizations,
In fact, I was challenged in the conference by the local SCIC representative who said to me that it's not true that we import European interpreters. So I said, well...
You probably had the figures to back it up.
Perhaps I misunderstood the African Development Bank and the United Nations of Nairobi, but this is what they told me. And then in the coffee break, there was a guy who came down from the booths and said to me, you're right, I come from Europe regularly.
Yeah.
So everybody's interested in their own... Everybody takes care of their own garden, let's say.
I guess that's the last big topic I wanted to talk about. The thing is, at the SCIC Universities conference, you always gave a talk, which was always a fixed thing at these conferences about trends in interpreting.
Yep.
And you would talk about, how interpreting developed in the institutions mainly, and what went up, demand went down, these kinds of things. So what's your sort of, I guess, takeaway for the last years, and maybe how would you see it develop in the next year? So in terms of the importance of English, or just how meetings develop, and maybe the role of technology, if that's not too much of an ask.
Well, I would premise that I don't think English is going to go away, despite what people say. I mean, the UK may leave, or it may not. This all remains to be seen. Or we may come back, who knows?
Yes. You may never leave, who knows,
Absolutely. So I premise that I believe that the English will stay. So that won't make that much difference to the language arrangements. That's my own point of view. What goes up and down, or what has fluctuated, has been the demand for interpreting in the Commission, and to some extent we saw that was occasioned by better regulation, i.e. cutting down on the regulation that was not considered to be priority, and therefore the number of meetings went down, the number of the amount of interpreting went down too. We don't know which way that will go. And I don't have any gypsy teapot to look into my tea leaves with. I don't think that the profession will disappear, first of all, let me say that. I think this is quite clear. We're here to stay. There is more and more multilingual communication, and I think there will always be work for colleagues who are appropriately qualified, because many outside who are doing multilingual work aren't properly qualified. And often they still think, it's still thought in companies that you can just wing it. So-and-so from packaging knows a bit of English and he can take care of this. But there's a lot of research that's shown that a sloppy website with imperfect communication is an instant turn-off, and people just don't stay on it. So that's clear. The UK accepted that the lack of knowledge of foreign languages was, I think, provoking, if I remember right, 3.5% less GDP.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's an awful lot.
And a hell of a lot more than would be required to reinstate a very good language program. They used to have a very intensive program for foreign diplomats, for diplomats, UK diplomats going abroad, of which one of our colleagues was one at one stage. And then they did away with that. And they did away with the foreign languages school. And after a few years, they decided to reinstate it all, because they could see the losses coming in very quickly indeed. So I don't think there will be an end to multilingualism. I don't believe either the Ostler view that English is the last lingua franca and that technology will take over. I'm not saying never, because you can never say never, but it won't be for a good while yet. And I think that, at any rate, I've always thought this, the people who did the stage with me did not necessarily all pass, but the ones who failed went on to get very good jobs. I know one of them who was in my particular group, and he's been a journalist in Beijing. And if you think about it, the skills that we teach in interpreting are what? Learning to listen properly, understanding, reformulating, repackaging, and getting it out.
And work your way into different topics. I always use that analogy as well, actually.
Absolutely, which is all you need to do a lot of jobs. I mean, it's quite clear that nowadays, before, the hierarchy used to be exactly that. It was a pyramid. The boss said something, and this order was relayed down and sort of detailed more and more for each thing. And that's not the way it is now. We're in the knowledge society. There are lots and lots of graduates at the bottom of the pyramid who have lots of interesting and intelligent things to say, and non-graduates too. And nowadays, you have to be able to argue your proposal. And therefore, communication skills are essential. So I think even if you don't pass, even if you don't get a job as an interpreter, it's not the end of the world. You can still be well equipped to get a very good job.
With these skills, And how do you see the role of technology develop? I mean, we've seen in recent years that there's been remote interpreting. We do occasionally in the council. Do you see that become more important in terms of quantity as well?
I think so, because it used to be that travel was prestigious and glamorous, and that's no longer the case. Travel is much more for business. Absolutely, for business, travel is a pain most of the time and a distraction, and you're away from your desk, and it takes you a long time to recover afterwards, etc.
Especially with security nowadays.
Absolutely, and the other reason is why should you? When there is a good way of doing it, and we're getting there. I think we're there. I don't think that remote interpretation is a problem in itself. I just think that the problem will be to ensure that there is no degradation and deterioration. I don't think anybody wants to end up in underground car parks or whatever, but I don't think it'll come to that.
It doesn't have to.
No, I don't see why it should. I mean, we're still very experienced professionals. They could do that with other people, but in the end, as I said to you before, I think it's a universal qualification. Being a good conference interpreter, you can do lots and lots and lots of job. I was interviewed by a journalist about this some time ago, and I said to him, well, it's a bit like you. You have to come here, you have to understand everything I'm saying, you have to make sense of it, and then you have to reformulate it. I said the difference is with the interpreters, we have to tell the truth.
Did he agree with that?
He laughed.
Okay. This has been episode 32 of the Lang FM podcast, a conversation with Brian Fox. For all the other episodes that I've done so far, just head on over to langfm.audio, that's langfm.audio. And why not subscribe, so you don't miss any future episodes. It would also be nice if you could leave a quick review on iTunes or anywhere else where you find your podcasts and listen to them. That would be much appreciated. Talk to you soon on Lang FM.
I still remember, did I ever tell you about les eaux déshydratés? Les eaux déshydratés? In a customs tariff meeting? Les eaux déshydratés, and that was, there was silence from the booth. We all went round on relay to see what the others had said.
What was it? I forgot.
It was the plural of garlic.